During the height of the Cold War, the ocean depths were not just a physical space, but a chessboard where silence was the most valuable piece in sound, the most lethal threat. In that context of technological paranoia and high-risk espionage, the recordings obtained by underwater microphones were not only used to track enemy ships. Sometimes, they captured anomalies that defied military and scientific logic, bringing governments to the brink of panic. What was recorded by cameras and hydrophones on submarines and listening stations during the Cold War is a chronicle that oscillates between technical ingenuity, pseudoscientific experimentation, and situations so absurd that they ended up being frightening, not because of their warlike nature, but because of the fragility of human certainties. Leave a like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. One of the most daring episodes of this period occurred when British intelligence pulled off a feat of espionage that seemed straight out of a work of fiction. They discovered that a Polish vessel, operating under the guise of a commercial ship, was secretly dragging a very long submerged chain. This chain was not ballast, but a high-tech hydrophone system designed by the Soviet bloc to intercept acoustic communications from Western submarines. The British response was surgical and daring. A Royal Navy vessel stealthily positioned itself behind the spy ship, taking advantage of an acoustic blind spot where the Polish ship's own propellers masked its presence. With a precise maneuver, the British crew cut the chain and took the hydrophones away for analysis, leaving the Poles to believe that the equipment had been damaged by a natural accident. This event underscored that, at sea, whoever has the best hearing has the power. But it also revealed that even the most sophisticated technology can be outsmarted by tactical audacity. However, not all Cold War efforts were based on mechanical engineering. In the 70s, paranoia reached almost esoteric levels. The CIA received reports that the Soviet Union was conducting psychic experiments that bordered on the macabre. The Soviet program attempted to prove the existence of long-distance telepathic communication using a brutal method. They murdered baby rabbits inside their deep-sea submarines to measure whether the mother rabbits, who remained in laboratories on land, felt a physiological or psychic reaction at the exact moment of their offspring's death. This experiment sought to determine if telepathy could be a viable method for sending messages to submerged ships that could not use radio. Terrified by the possibility of falling behind in a mental arms race, Americans launched their own psychic project, ironically putting a Scientologist at the helm. After investing astronomical sums of money in research that produced no tangible results, the agency canceled the program, leaving one of the strangest and darkest stains on the record of military intelligence. While these shadows moved in the realm of espionage, in Northern Europe, a real physical event unleashed a national crisis that would last for decades. In 1981, a Soviet Whiskey-class submarine accidentally ran aground on rocks in a restricted military zone near the Swedish naval base of Karlskrona. This incident, dubbed Whiskey on the Rocks, broke Swedish neutrality and plunged the country into a state of permanent red alert. The Swedish government, convinced that its waters were being systematically violated by a fleet of infiltrated ships, allocated massive emergency funds to develop a top-secret underwater detection system. Sweden became an invisible battlefield. Depth charges were dropped, and mines were detonated at the slightest sign of suspicion. The Swedish Navy amassed a database of acoustic signs that they considered irrefutable proof of the presence of intruders. Even after the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War was declared over, the Swedish detection system continued to be activated with alarming frequency. Sweden, trapped in its own security narrative, continued to blame Russia for carrying out illegal incursions during a period of supposed peace. It was not until 1995 that a new Swedish government, seeking transparency, established a commission to investigate these irregularities. It was at this point that civilian science came into contact with the secretive military world, and what they found turned out to be one of the most embarrassing and surprising episodes in naval history. The research team, which included biological scientist Håkan Westerberg, was given permission to listen to what the Navy considered its queen of evidence: the typical sound. This noise was the most secret acoustic indicator, a recording that top military commanders swore was the sound signature of secret Soviet propulsion systems, something never before seen that allowed them to maneuver in the Swedish archipelago. When Westerberg and his student Magnus Wahlberg first heard the recording, they were astonished. The sound was not reminiscent of a machine, but rather of a flock of birds chattering, or, more mundanely, the sizzling of bacon frying in a pan. It was a chorus of small, high-pitched sounds that repeated rhythmically. Before reaching a conclusion about this noise, the Commission discovered another monumental error in the Navy's acoustic database. For years, they had been tracking what they believed to be the cavitation sound of small submarine propellers. It turned out that the sound was produced by swimming minks. Someone, in a moment of pure chance, recorded the sound while watching one of these mammals moving in the water. When swimming, the minks flap their forelegs rhythmically, which, through hydrophones, sounds exactly like a four-bladed propeller. This discovery was the first blow to the credibility of naval intelligence experts, but the worst was yet to come with the typical sound. Westerberg, an expert in fish acoustics, suspected a biological explanation. After intense investigations and controlled tests, the truth emerged. The sound that had kept a nation on edge and on the brink of an accidental war was produced by herrings. Herring have a swim bladder connected to their anal canal, and to communicate with each other or adjust their buoyancy in large schools, they expel gas bubbles. In essence, what the Swedish Navy had registered as secret Russian propulsion systems were massive flatulences from schools of herring. When millions of these fish swam together and released gas simultaneously, they created an acoustic chorus that military sensors, programmed for paranoia, interpreted as enemy technology. Leave a like, subscribe, and share. This discovery horrified the military command, but for a different reason than the CIA rabbits or the British hydrophones. They were horrified by the realization that they had based their foreign policy, defense spending, and national security on a biological misinterpretation. The panic of the 80s and 90s in Sweden was, to a large extent, an acoustic construct fueled by a lack of communication between biologists and the military. The Cold War had created an environment where any unexplained noise had to be, by default, a threat. The history of these records in submarines and listening stations teaches us that technology, however advanced, is always subject to observer bias. In the British case, the technology worked, but human ingenuity prevailed. In the case of rabbits, science was sacrificed on the altar of strategic superstition. And in the case of Sweden, nature itself mocked the most expensive defense systems in the world. What truly terrified everyone in the end was not the presence of an invincible enemy, but the ease with which fear can transform the natural behavior of a fish or a mink into a steel phantom capable of destabilizing a nation. The Cold War at sea was a war of perceptions. The underwater recordings often showed a world that humans were not prepared to understand without prejudice. The silence of the submarines was so profound that the slightest noise was amplified in the imagination of the intelligence analysts. Swedish herrings and swimming minks are today comical reminders of a period of extreme tension, but they are also a lesson on the importance of multidisciplinarity. If the Navy had consulted marine biologists from the beginning, millions of crowns and years of national anxiety would have been saved. Today, when we look back at those records, we see a mixture of the tragic and the absurd. Psychological experiments on animals speak to a scientific desperation that today seems cruel and useless to us. The theft of hydrophones speaks to a physical bravery that is now being replaced by cyber attacks. But the mystery of underwater noises remains relevant. In an ocean that is becoming increasingly noisy due to human activity, distinguishing between a biological process, a geological phenomenon, and a manned vessel remains a top priority technical challenge. The typical sound that so frightened Sweden is now an anecdote in military history and biology books, but its legacy remains. It reminds us that, often, the monsters we fear in the darkness or in the abyss are projections of our own fears and not external realities. The Cold War is over, but the human capacity to be frightened by the unknown, interpreting it through the filter of conflict, remains intact. The recordings from those old submarines didn't just capture sounds. They captured the spirit of an era where the truth was buried under layers of secrecy, paranoia, and, at times, under the noisy natural life of the fish in the Baltic Sea. Håkan Westerberg's revelation not only closed a chapter in Swedish history, but also allowed science to claim a place at the national security table. He demonstrated that knowledge of the natural environment is as crucial as knowledge of the enemy's capabilities. In the end, what the cameras and hydrophones recorded was not an invasion, but the vibrant and sometimes noisy life of the ocean, which continued its course oblivious to human ideologies and borders. The initial shock transformed into a lesson in humility. We are not the only owners of sound in the sea, and sometimes what sounds like a propeller is simply life making its way. In conclusion, the stories of the Polish spy ship, the Soviet psychic experiments, and the Swedish spy herrings form a perfect triptych of Cold War madness and ingenuity. Each of these events, in its own way, changed how countries manage their underwater surveillance. Today, with much more advanced signal processing technology, a mink is less likely to be mistaken for a submarine, but the human factor, the tendency to see what we fear, remains. The ocean remains a place of profound mysteries, and what cameras record in the future will continue to surprise and perhaps frighten those who dare to listen too closely to the echoes of the abyss. This journey through the acoustic secrets of the Cold War invites us to reflect on the importance of transparency and scientific verification. In a world where information can be manipulated or misinterpreted, the story of the Swedish herrings warns us about the dangers of decisions made in the isolation of military secrecy. The next time a hydrophone picks up an unexplained sound in the depths, the answer shouldn't be to drop depth charges, but to ask those who know the secrets of marine life. Because, as Sweden learned the hard way, sometimes the loudest enemy is not a missile-laden submarine, but a school of fish simply being fish in the vast and enigmatic blue of the ocean. Leave a like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.